Okay, so thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak this morning at this event. As I've been introduced, my name is Professor William Webster. I am a Professor of Public Policy and Management. I'm not a lawyer. So I am also the Director of CRISP, which is the Centre for Research into Information Surveillance and Privacy. This is a research network that's shared between universities of Edinburgh, Essex, St Andrews and Stirling. I'm the Stirling Director. And we have quite a broad social science remit. We're interested in the implications and consequences of surveillance practices and privacy in quite a broadly defined area. We have a number of different research projects on the go at any one time, and probably across the four institutions, there's roughly 40 or so researchers involved in the various things that we do, including a number of public engagement activities. Okay, so you're welcome to ask me about CRISP, I guess, in the coffee breaks or the lunch breaks or something like that. My areas of expertise around public policy, public management. I've got a strong interest in e-government. I'm the editor-in-chief of a journal called Information Polity. And I've got a long-standing interest in surveillance, which originates from my doctoral research on surveillance cameras going back into the 90s. Okay, so the title of my presentation is all data the same? The ramifications of big data practices in public services. Now, the inspiration for this paper was a research project called Big Data Surveillance, which is just coming to an end. It was run out of Canada. I think the last event is in a couple of weeks. And really what I was trying to do in this piece of work was really draw out the differences in data that aren't always obvious and what that might mean for public services. So to draw out some of the assumptions about the way we think about the use of data in public service environments. Okay, so some of the elements may be a bit basic for this audience, so I might skip over them, in particular things like data protection principles. What I'll try and focus on is some of the more interesting elements of the paper. So the underlying theme is that not all data is the same, and the different types of data need to be reflected on in the way that they might be used in public service and public policy contexts. Okay, this is a presentation I have done before. It's not completely new. So some of my Stirling colleagues may see some bits and pieces here that they've seen before, but I'm gonna get going. Now, this is someone else's laptop, so I hope I'm pressing the right button. Yes, it worked perfectly. It's very similar to mine. Okay, so our starting point then is what we might mean by the term big data. Okay. So I've got 3 quotes here to just illuminate some of the underlying themes and rhetoric around the terminology. And really a core idea here is that big data has become big business. Big business commercially, big business in terms of the application and use of big data practices in public service environments. We've already heard this term yesterday, oil of the 21st century. I can't remember, it may have been in reflection to date, the use of data yesterday, but we see it as a term which is associated with a driver for innovation. We see it as a term which is used around the infrastructure of public services. We also see it as a term which is about providing the delivery of public services and improving public services. And then we have this quote at the end here, which is, big data is like teenage sex. Everybody talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everybody thinks everybody else is doing it, so everybody claims they're doing it. And sometimes when we talk about big data, there is a sense that it is a little bit of a dark art. Certainly when I talk to public service managers, they all know that their services are engaging in big data processes and practices, but they're not really all sure exactly what is happening and how they go about it, which is part of one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so obviously when we talk about big data, we mean lots of data, okay? So what we're talking about. Okay, this data can come from lots of different sources, and that's one of the key elements or the key characteristics of the big data landscape. Data can originate from lots of different places. So it can be public data, which might be administrative data, such as an electoral register, or data emanating from medical records. It could be enterprise data, which might be commercial data, driven by insurance companies, for example. It could come from transactions in e-commerce. It could come from social media. We all know the social media platforms. And it could be sensory data. So for example, from surveillance cameras, other devices in the smart city environment around urban areas. But how much data are we talking about? what is big data? What's little data? So what are we really talking about here when we talk about numbers? Okay, so how much data is big data? Now I'm not going to go through all of these on this slide, but you know, some of these statements here: 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. 1 billion Twitter tweets per 72 hours. The point of these bullet points here is that these numbers are almost incomprehensible. They are humongous. And what I would also point out about this particular slide is that the citation is 2012. Okay, so this is probably completely out of date. Okay, and the numbers are already huge. So you can only just imagine what they might be now, especially given our online practices during and post the pandemic. So we can imagine, I probably should update this slide, but I like to make that point. Okay, so big data is humongous amounts of data, but how do we define the characteristics of big data? And there's a number of different ways that we think about big data, and there's some characteristics I particularly want to draw out. Okay, so this is the textbook definition of big data. Okay, and I've taken this diagram from a textbook. So big data in textbooks is often defined as the 3 V's: variety, velocity, and volume. And just very quickly, velocity is the speed at which data is processed and used, and it can often be used and processed in real time. Variety are the completely different types of data sets that can be used in big data practices. They can be brought together. They can be combined into new useful data sets. They can be structured and unstructured data sets. So a new set of practices around different types of data set. And then we have the volume, which I've already alluded to, which is the sheer size of the amount of data that's being utilized. However, beyond this textbook definition, we can see a number of other important features, especially for public policy and public service landscape. Okay, so already talked about the 3 V's. There is also a 4th V in some more modern textbooks, which is about veracity. And this is where there is an argument that big data can be used to point to observable truths. Now, as a social scientist, I might question that, which is why I got it on the slide separately from the first diagram. Okay, so what we see around big data then is also some other important characteristics. Importantly, the use of algorithms, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. So the data sets are not static. They are processed, they're used, they are examined, they are used in ways which are designed to create value and benefit. There is a desire to use all the data that's available. So a desire to maximize use from the data that is created. Data sets, therefore, do not have to be complete. They're not all perceived to be like the electoral register, where there's a degree of completion and perfection, or we would like to think there is. Data sets in the big data world are maybe more akin to what we might see on Twitter, where they're not complete data sets, but they're usable. We use what we have. So there's a desire to maximize value from what is available. And then we start to see more repurposing of data. Reusing data and finding new ways of creating value. So a data set which might be created around transport in Glasgow, for example, might be reusable to tell us some insights about health. So the reworking of data sets. Okay, so what we hear here is that a technological context which points to the predictive power of big data. And this has potential then to be used in public policy and public services, as well as obviously in commercial applications, but I'm not really talking about those in this presentation. Okay, so some particular public service, public policy context. First of all, we might have the Open Government Initiative, which is the drive to make data sets open to the public, often actually not always open to the public, but maybe open to researchers, open to private companies, to be used, reworked, combined with other data. Glasgow City Council, for example, has over 400 different data sets that we as researchers can get access to. And we start to see big data being used in contexts that are widely talked about, such as smart city contexts, e-government, the Internet of Things that we're all familiar with. And there are a couple of elements of big data that I think are really important. There's a kind of technological side, which is the growth of data analytics and data science, the technical bit. But then we have in the public service environment, which I think is of equal importance, is the data visualization. So how the data science is converted for managers and public policy officials who are not data scientists, how they can work with the data and make it useful. And sometimes they don't want to have that technical expertise, but they want to have access to ways of interpreting the data. So making the data comprehensible. Okay, so what we see then around big data, if we think about some of the state-of-the-art practices, is the general rhetoric that big data will lead to better services and public policy. If we make better use of the data, we will have this potentially more accurate public policy and better decisions around public services. And we see that smart cities are a test bed for many of these initiatives. And I could give you some examples, but I'm slightly wary of the time, so I'm just going to keep moving on. Now, what we find also, which is not unusual to lots of technological scenarios, is that a lot of the outcomes are speculative. They're focused on anticipated effects rather than grounded in empirical studies. There's anecdotal evidence, often driven by commercial interests, about what the big data practices will deliver. So in Glasgow, I'm using Glasgow as an example because that was our kind of case study city. There are lots of smart city initiatives. One, for example, was a smart cycling app, which was providing information which allowed people to behave differently, allowed them to provide services differently. So it altered people's cycling behaviours, but it also altered the provision of cycling by the city council. And then we have the smart cities bin collection as well. I can talk about all these examples later maybe. Okay, so within the big data portfolio and the big data agenda, there's a neglection of existing organizational practices and institutions and how they shape organizations going forward. So if we look at the literature around big data, we see it's almost like the technological hammer hitting the old organization in terms of what can be achieved with big data, as opposed to how it's really going to work. The private sector is held up as a benchmark in the way that it uses new technology, as opposed to public services, which are perceived to be behind the times. And there's a dire need in this environment to have critical social science perspectives about how big data practices are impacting on public service organizations. Okay, so the rhetoric around big data captures a diverse range of practices and information flows. It's often seen as a good thing. It can only make public services better. But there's an alternative line of argument, and it's a line of argument that maybe appeals to someone like myself who's been an e-government scholar for a number of years. And that's the argument that there's nothing new here, actually, because what we see is that public services have been doing big data type things for years. Okay, there is a track record of public services collecting and processing data. There's a history of e-government, goes back 40 years. Just think of tax records and how long they've been handled online, let alone as a paper-based filing system, and then in between with personal computers and large computers. So the business of government at central and local levels has often been administratively based and often based around computing. So there's lots of data sharing protocols supported by the data protection legislation that we have in place. Public services are very used to doing this. There's an established set of e-government practices. There's an established set of e-government literatures, and there's an established set of governance mechanisms, whatever we think of them. Okay, so you could say, well, big data might be new, but there's nothing really to see here because the public sector, the public services have been dealing with these things for quite some time. Okay, in practice though, I would argue that there are some significant and substantive changes around the big data portfolio. Big data changes the e-government landscape in a number of ways. First of all, we have this access to administrative data sets, this open government. This never really happened before, not to the extent that it's happening now. Now, there are critiques that actually, whilst these data sets have been made available, not many people are actually using them. That's a separate line of argument. Okay, we also see the expansion of open and data sharing protocols. These have proliferated in the last 15 years. So think, for example, of MAPA sharing data between local authorities and policing agencies. So this is now common practice, and public service officials are now well versed in the importance of data sharing and the need to do that in order to improve public services. Okay, and then we start to see more of the use of social media data in public service environments, in terms of forming public policy and in terms of making decisions about public services. And this can be problematic. I can give you an example that, that we studied quite a few years ago. I won't name the local authority, but a local authority was going to be building a new crematorium. You could probably Google it, because how many new crematoriums are there in Scotland? They were building a new crematorium. They had 3 or 4 potential locations, and you were using a traditional consultation exercise, but they decided they would also use social media, and they used some scraping tools to gauge public opinion. They used that information to make their decision on where to locate that crematorium. Now, there's a whole set of problems there in terms of who that social media reached, whether or not it reached the community in that local authority, and who in turn kind of did they consent to their views being used in this way. So sometimes the completeness of Twitter data, of social media data, can cause problems for public policy decisions. What we also see that I would say is, which I've not got on this list here, I must have run out of space, but in terms of other substantive changes, is the use of more algorithms for decision makings in public service, whether you're entitled to a public service, whether you get access to refugee status, for example. And we also start to see an extended influence within public services of data scientists. While statisticians have always been used in government, we see that data scientists are becoming more important as a profession within public agencies. Now, the next slide is my favorite slide. And this is one that my colleagues may have seen before. Okay, this is what I refer to as the Air Canada big data typology. And the reason for this is because I sketched this out on a flight to Canada, and I did it so neatly that I've just kept it. I haven't bothered redrafting it, because it makes perfect sense to me, and it's very, well, I like to think it's very clear. Okay, so the purpose of this typology was really, really simple. What I was trying to do here was to draw out some of the differences in data so that I could then make the argument that this might pose problems for public service providers, or that at the very least we could reflect on some of those potential problem areas. It's essentially a 2x2 typology. It's very simple. The types of data are on the vertical axis, and the ownership of data are on the horizontal axis. And the idea is you could take any data set and you could plot it on that chart there. So the type of data is either would be personal data, where the person was identifiable, or it could be administrative, commercial, or service data about the service or the policy where people weren't identifiable. In terms of ownership, that could be the public service provider, or it could be a commercial company, but it was very unlikely to be individual people. They don't own their own data. So some important points to note here: people don't own their own data. Different rules that apply to different types of data, for example, personal data, mean that data sets will be handled differently depending on where they're plotted on this chart. And that's significant. But then what we have with big data is that these data sets start to be integrated. They start to merge to create new data sets, new opportunities, new value from these hybrid data sets. Now, these hybrid data sets, 2 minutes, right, okay, I'll be very quick, can cause problems, because once when the data was all seen as different rules applied. But what happens with the new hybrid data sets? Who owns these new data sets? What rules apply? Do the commercial rules apply, or do the public sector rules apply? And this is where public services on the ground have found difficulties in complying with rules around the use of data. Okay, so what rules apply? And we have a sort of pseudo privatization then of data taking place. So the once open data sets have been integrated into commercial data sets to allow commercial services to provide their services. And this is happening in and outside public service environments. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about data protection principles, so I know that everybody knows those. And I'm going to go straight to the concluding comments, which I think we can just run through as a result of the line of argument that I've been making. And really what I've got here is really a set of points for consideration, or points, if you like, a research agenda. Okay, so big data then represents a critical point, a game changer in the evolution of public policy and services, especially if we look at e-government. If we take an e-government perspective, we can see if we were plotting out the major points of change over the years, big data would represent one of them. Initiatives associated with big data offer significant opportunities for service redesign, the co-production of services and policy, and our current government has signalled that they want the UK to be a world leader in big data and artificial intelligence. So it's an agenda that's being driven by our current government. Those charged with creating and implementing public policy have no choice but to confront the challenges posed by big data. And this often means local authorities and other public service providers grappling with these sorts of issues to make sure that they provide legitimate, fair public services that are delivered in the public interest. So the challenge is going to be to balance the opportunities offered by big data at the same time as safeguarding personal data and ensuring an effective service. And I've interviewed many public service managers in my academic career, and I've never met an academic, I've never met a public manager who said, oh yes, I want to exploit people, exploit data in an unfair way. They all want to do it to the best of their ability in the public interest. Okay, so big data assumptions that I started this presentation with shouldn't be taken for granted. There's a need for a more sophisticated, more nuanced understanding and conceptualization of how big data will work in a public service environment. And those public agencies who are the guardians of our personal data and of the public services have a duty and a moral obligation to safeguard our data and to establish governance arrangements that are suitable for the big data age. Okay, so what we can anticipate going forward is that there will be a need to discuss and refine government governance arrangements. Information flows will become more critical and strained. We will see more breaches, it's inevitable. We will start to see more re-individualization, more repurposing of data. We can see that big data practically challenges every single data protection principle. So the challenges ahead then are technical, they are around governance, and they are around policy and practice. And this is going to be a very fruitful area for academia in the next decade ahead, I would say. And I'm probably slightly over time.